I'm Shaan Sachdev. I'm a writer from New York City. For the last 5 years or so, I've primarily written cultural essays and criticism. I have a master's degree in cultural writing, and the strange thing about the genre is you end up writing about such a wide range of subjects that the only thing you become an expert in is the art of non-expertise, of affecting the illusion of specialization. So I've recently written about the Iraq War's disputed civilian death toll, the decline of the pedestrian experience in Manhattan, Wikipedia's relationship to the pandemic, about Hannah Arendt, Beyonce, Matthew Perry, a number of other subjects. And I've written about them for national newspapers like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, as well as for wonderful smaller journals like The Point and New England Review. And when I applied to Jentel, I planned to write a nonfiction book very much in line with the style of my previous essays. But shortly before arriving here, I was struck out of nowhere with the idea for a novel. I realized I had 1,000 small fragments of unresolved or undiscussed ideas, and also the desperate need to gossip about other writers in my world, and perhaps gossip most of all about myself. I realized perhaps only fiction or autofiction might give me the freedom to explore those fragments. And so for the last blissful 2 weeks, Jentel is truly sublime, I've been working on my first ever fiction project. The novel is tentatively titled War in Brooklyn, 9.5 Portraits. And each chapter sketches a different writer in relation to the novel's central character named Solomon. So I'm going to read a little bit from the first chapter's third section, which is titled Woman Eating Orange. The first chapter is a portrait of a writer named Pablo. Can everyone hear me well? This is good? Okay. In truly close friendships, philosophical and psychical dilemmas eventually break the surface. Between Pablo and Solomon, the problems had begun by trickling into their idyll about 9 months in, modeling it with increasingly lurid colors, like one of Olafur Eliasson's riverine installations. One summer evening, they'd stopped by the Salma Gandhi Club on their way to the L train. Pablo had been drawn in by the Lisa Yaskovich exhibit, which primarily featured a series of topless women handling fruit, framed by abstractly gloomy tableaus. 15 minutes into their detour, Solomon had frozen up in front of Woman Eating Orange, in which a woman with wildly unkempt hair indeed ate an orange, the juice dribbling down her chin and onto her pointy breasts. Everything in the painting had been black and white except for the fruit and its juice, which had been vividly, almost mawkishly orange. The painting had jarred within Solomon the caginess he'd sometimes feel at exhibitions and events, when his fervors and aspirations seemed to be roused by the art on display, while simultaneously attacked by the expectations that he cede control, stay silent, suppress whatever creativity arose within himself, forcing him to thus receive without making, to helplessly genuflect as he was belittled and diminished and hammered into the throes of nihility. He'd feel this too sometimes when he was reading, when a page could scarcely be turned without ideas bursting out of him, without him having to pause to write them down, to reify his interior, even if it meant never finishing the book. Solomon had long been aware that this impulse to extrude rather than absorb was a fairly masculine one. It's not that he was a manic babbler in the unilateral key that characterized so many men whose proclamations enveloped the poor listener like a locust swarm, and whose infrequent questions served only to brusquely justify keeping up the assault. If Solomon had a lot to say, he thought, it was simply because his head was a fount of impressions. That day, Solomon had wanted to leave the gallery, to walk with Pablo to the L train discussing the few pieces they saw, for surely a few pieces were enough. He'd wanted also to talk about other things, to construct new notions, to resurrect the inner voices that had been quieted by the looking. But if Solomon tended to find energy in the crises of meaning and individuality provoked in him by art, Pablo was vitalized by the joy of imploring surfaces, of middling surfaces too, if it meant being in a room with other contented oglers. Pablo found joy even in the outside sidewalk's redolent grit, the upbeat expectancy of the air-conditioned foyer, the very existence of the chance to collectively gape and grin and suspire. For Pablo, being moved from without was a way of life, and an irradiating one at that. Pablo had appeared surprised but unruffled that Solomon wanted to leave. Okay, he'd said brightly, see you for dinner day after tomorrow, and Solomon had walked out alone and nettled. He'd gone straight to his office, where he'd tried until midnight to write something captivating, and then left for home defeated. For a decade, Solomon's eye had been on his literary ambitions. He'd written frantically in his early 20s, but published nowhere, read by no one save for Claire, his closest friend from college. Then he'd entered the university, where Sadie taught him the difference between writing for oneself and writing for others, between ideating in private and in public. He'd started publishing as soon as he graduated, and he right away found himself rapacious for ascension. As soon as one piece was done, he chased the next idea, the next byline, the next literary rung. After publishing with a respected but diminutive operation, say The Progressive, he'd soon develop a distaste for the magazine that lurched toward contempt. Flushed with embarrassment at the incrementalism of his craft, he'd seek something bigger and better, a better essay in a more prestigious publication. Soon it was rarely the case that he would sink into a moment or idea for the thrill of the experience alone. No, it would have to be to write about it, to filter it through the prism of his solipsisms and then render it for the public. But Solomon had also learned, reading literary magazines and essay collections, that a solid half of well-published writers had precious little to show from their own filtering and rendering. Even as he was scrambling and striving, he knew he'd eventually have to ask himself not whether something could be published, but whether it was worth publishing, whether his ideas were beautiful, interesting, enduring, or any good at all. Night after night, he'd sit at his desk in his small office at Pen and Sanctum, a handsomely droll writing space, the oldest in Brooklyn, where he'd long served as an administrator. If he was ascetic, it was in this sense. He'd refused 9 out of 10 invitations to go dancing or listen to jazz or mingle with ascendant literati at a book launch, preferring the elusive promise of his office's dark blue carpets and Art Deco paintings. Ringed by half a dozen lamps, he'd lock the door and try to read, pitch, and write. But Solomon had never been efficient at any of these things. He'd work slowly, unproductively, oscillating between bouts of doodling and bouts of edging himself, the latter of which he'd do instead of finishing himself off in one go, because he believed he worked more fruitfully when unspent. He'd thus try his very best not to finish, to click out of a video when he got close and returned to work, but invariably every time he'd end up finishing, and the suppressions together with a gradualism would result in an emittance whose velocity would overshoot the wastebasket, disappearing into the carpet's coarse bristles like rain into grass. For a time, he taped to his desk a laminated note card of endearingly despairing entries from Wittgenstein's diaries. February 23rd, 1915. Did no work. My difficulties have not been resolved. February 26th, 1915. Did no work. Will I ever work again? February 27th, 1915. Did no work. Dark mood. Strong sexual desire. Feeling lonely. Wittgenstein also worried about the enervation that came with spending oneself amid work. He called it squandering my inner strength. In another diary entry, he wrote, I have strong sexual feelings again and masturbate almost every day. It cannot continue this way. Yet just the other day, Solomon had peeled the laminated note card off his desk and thrown it away, feeling unworthy of the parallel, reminding himself too much of E.I. Launhoff, the great writer from Philip Roth's The Ghost Writer, who pinned bits of poetic inspiration upon the bulletin board by his desk. Having published only a few dozen essays and not a single book, Solomon knew he was no established writer, let alone a great one like Kundera, of whom Launhoff had served as an avatar. Each night, Solomon would walk home from his office, spent in one sense and throttled in another, the unfinished 2/3 of his agenda rattling around his conscience like a headache. He'd go straight to the kitchen and microwave some dal or spaghetti before putting on a bad movie that he'd usually already seen at least twice before. He'd drink one glass of wine, then another, and if the characters in the movie were drinking scotch, he'd pour himself a glass of bourbon, too, since he couldn't afford scotch. That's my little excerpt. Thank please.
How much of that is autobiographical?
Ah, possibly all of it, possibly none at all. Yes.
What's your process? Are you on a laptop? Do you have note cards? Do you longhand? How does that work for you?
Usually it's like walking around for a month just taking notes and then organizing them, printing them out, and then sitting at a laptop and using the notes. But I'll say that anytime there's even a moment of doubt or freezing up, just a walk around Jentel is like magic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When you do that, I mean, do you always carry a pad and paper?
I wish I did. It would be so much more romantic. But sadly, it's voice recordings on my phone. Which, well, it makes me look awfully modern, but yeah.
That's the new notepad.
Right. All right. Oh, yes.
Sorry, this is number 3, I guess. Do you have your phone transcribe those voice recordings for you, or do you do it yourself?
I insist on doing it myself. There are some really good AI programs that can do it for you, but I feel like you also then truly like relive through what you thought rather than have someone else do that for you.